There are countless tuning shops for German auto manufacturers, whether it be Brabus for Mercedes or Alpine for BMW. There's a lot of options out there, but not so much for Porsche, not anymore. But there is one company out of the many Porsche tuners that have tried and failed that is still kicking today. I'm talking about one of the most famous tuning shops of all time, and the only tuning shop that I can think of that progressed to an actual car company. I'm talking about Ruf. Alois Ruf founded a gas station garage and a bus company named Auto Ruf in 1939. And Alois was driving one of his buses when a Porsche 356 coupe overtook him and rolled into the ditch. Clearly not a very good driver. He was fine, but the 356 wasn't, and Alois bought the car and fixed it up himself. That was a big deal back then, because there weren't many repair shops that could handle the workload of fixing a 356. They later sold the car to a Porsche collector for a huge profit and expanded their workshop to become the Porsche garage in Germany. And the launch of the 911 only cemented their business. Sadly, Alois Ruf did not live to see the heights of his company, as he died in 1974, and the management of his new company, now Ruf Automobile, fell to his 24-year-old son, Alois Ruf Jr. Alois Jr. already loved the power-weight ratio of the OG 911, but that ratio grew more and more distant as the 70s progressed. So in 1975, he set out to make a Ruf 911. It was better than a base 911, but cheaper than a 911 Turbo, and it still carried the Porsche genes, unlike the 911's replacement, the 928. Specifically, it was an improved 911 SC called the SCR. It borrowed a lot from the 930 Turbo, especially in the styling department. However, it kept the base naturally aspirated flat 6. Oh, I thought you said they improved it, but they did. They gave the base engine extra displacement, Bosch fuel injection, a higher compression ratio, and an in-house designed 5-speed gearbox. That meant the SCR had more power and more fuel efficiency than the base 911, while costing 13,000 Deutschmarks less than the Turbo. If you did have 13,000 Deutschmarks, Ruf had you covered with the Turbo 3.3. It used, unsurprisingly based on the name, the Turbo's 3.3-liter flat 6, but Ruf gave it an extra 50 horsepower, which launched their 3.3 to 163 miles an hour during peak energy crisis year in 1975. The 3.3 would be so good that it stays in production until 1989. Ruf arguably saved the 911 by showing that the pre-war engine layout still had some life in it, and Porsche ended up canning the 928 in 1995. Well, the 911 is still going strong today. Meanwhile, back to our history, the 930 911 was sent off by Ruf with the Group B Turbo Ruf in 1983. The BTR was a serious step up from the 3.3. It was available as a wide body with a wing on top of the whale tail. The interior was stripped with racing harnesses and leather Recaro seats. The mirrors were stolen from the 935 race car, and its improved 3.4-liter 930 turbo engine made 370 horsepower. It was a 10-second car in the quarter mile, and even with over 200,000 miles on the odometer, it was still verified at 187 miles an hour at top speed. But the biggest thing about the BTR was that it was the first Ruf with a VIN number. See, Ruf became its own licensed manufacturer in Germany in 1983, so even though Porsche shipped them 20 or so bare 911 chassis, the BTR was a Ruf production car. But Ruf didn't rest on their laurels, and built a car so amazing it may very well have overshadowed every car the brand has made before or since. The Group C Turbo Ruf was an evolution of the BTR. The old 3.4-liter was rebuilt again, this time with twin turbos in the style of the new 959, and it had fuel injectors from the 962 Le Mans racer to make 463 horsepower and 408 foot-pounds of torque. And to make the CTR handle like it was a Group C race car, Ruf gave it a full roll cage, Brembo brakes, Dunlop sport tires, upgraded suspension, their own custom gearbox, and removed 400 pounds from the weight. That meant a power-weight ratio of just 5.5 pounds per horsepower, with a radio, air conditioning, and a full roll cage. Bear in mind that Ferrari's own featherweight turbo monster, the F40, had 5.8 pounds per horsepower with none of the amenities that I just listed. I mean, you could even adjust the brake bias with a dial on the dashboard, for Christ's sake. It was a serious race car first and foremost. So the rear-wheel drive CTR from 1987 could hit 60 in 3.7 seconds and reach 189 miles an hour in the standing mile. Ruf figured they had a good car, but even they were surprised by the sheer speed of the thing. And it would get to show off that speed at Road and Track's World's Fastest Car Shootout in April 1987. And similarly to Nissan's R32 GTR, the CTR would earn its iconic nickname in the heat of battle. That year's event featured the best of the best from Porsche, Ferrari, Lamborghini, and Mercedes, and the CTR blew past them like they were in park. Past the 288 GTO, past the 959, past 200 miles an hour, and on to 211. Not only was it the first production car to be verified above 200 miles an hour, it made it the fastest production car in the world by some margin. The F40 could only hit 199. The Road and Track photographic team called it a Yellowbird dashing across the horizon. The great irony is that Ruf was going to paint it red, and Redbird does not have the same impact as Yellowbird when you say it out loud. The reason why they turned it yellow is because their test driver reasoned that all the Italian teams would have red cars and yellow would be a good contrast. Smart guy. And the craziest thing wasn't that Ruf said it was slightly under-geared for its shootout, which meant later tests hit 213. It was that the Yellowbird's greatest moment was coming up. They took it to the Nürburgring, but instead of scorching lap times, they went to scorch tires. Using a helicopter, a few onboard cameras, and a really skilled driver, Ruf made Fascination at the Nürburgring in 1987. It's basically a Gymkhana run of the entire Nordschleife, with the Yellowbird sliding sideways at 110% attack. It was the automotive video of the 80s, maybe even the 20th century, with VHS copies spreading around the globe like a pre-internet viral video. It's one of the finest car videos ever made, as both Fascination and the CTR in general made Ruf internationally recognized. Without the CTR, Ruf would not be where it is today. Hell, it might not even exist at all, to be honest. Only 29 were made from scratch by Ruf, while the other 30-ish were converted from 93911s. The CTR was followed up by Ruf's efforts with the new 964 generation 911, and versions range from the 286 horsepower CR4 to the strangely named BTR3, which was a culmination of the OG BTR. There's no 2, that comes later, weird like I said. But now the BTR3 had 400 horsepower with larger tires and Ruf's usual driver focus, i.e. bare bones, interior. So it can do 0 to 124 miles an hour faster than a base Fiesta reaches 60. But the big leap came in the form of a pair of iconic sequels from the new 993 platform. The BTR2, again, weird name, and the CTR2. The BTR2 is the more entry-level pair of the two. Think of it like a 911 GT3 compared to a GT2, because it's still got over 400 horsepower, but the CTR2 expanded into 90s hypercar territory. The $315,000 rocket had 580 horsepower and a better aero kit to increase downforce compared to the Yellowbird. That downforce negated some of the straight-line speed in exchange for more controllability. And you want controllability at over 220 miles an hour. The only production car faster was the McLaren F1 in the entire world. 28 were made in total, and unlike other Rufs, these saw competition. specifically the Pikes Peak International Hill Climb, where two CTR2s, driven by the Ruf family themselves, finished 2nd and 4th overall in 1997. And they were street legal. They drove them to the event, raced these 700 horsepower supercars up the dirt hill climb, and then drove them back. But their big break into the American market wasn't at a track in 1997, it was at home in 2000. Because that is when EA signed an exclusive deal with Porsche that made every Porsche exclusively for Need for Speed and real racing. Forza did have a licensing deal in place with EA's game developers to allow Porsche in their games as DLC, but not in the base games. But then people looked at Ruf and saw that they were registered as a German manufacturer and therefore had their own VIN numbers. So they looked like Porsches, they sounded like Porsches, but legally speaking, they weren't Porsches, which meant EA had no power over them. And immediately Rufs began popping up in PGR, Gran Turismo, Project Cars, The Crew, Forza, you name it. EA's license ended in 2016 and Ruf hasn't been allowed to share the screen with Porsche since, but for that 16-year period, every video gamer in the world learned who Ruf is. And that helped a lot, because their work on the new 997 911 was some of their best yet. First, there was the RGT with a dry sump lubrication system good for nearly 400 horsepower. Not to be outdone, the RT Turbo launched a year later with optional all-wheel drive and 590 horsepower, giving it a 0 to 60 of just 3.2 seconds. And if you wanted some uniqueness for your 911, you could get the R compressor, which had a supercharged flat 6 making 450 horsepower. But the biggest guy on the block was unquestionably the RT12 from 2004. All but two of them came in all-wheel drive, which is good, because the fastest version had 720 horsepower and 700 torque. And then Ruf rebuilt the suspension, and the bodywork, and the brakes to make it more compatible with the Ruf engine. Standard gearing puts it at 224 miles an hour, but taller gears can reportedly hit even higher speeds. The final 997 spec Rufs were the craziest Porsches yet, and if you thought the supercharger was sacrilegious, then you might want to mute for a few seconds, because the RGT8 is not for you. You see, the second-gen RGT was plenty for your average Porsche fan, 450 horsepower, 0 to 64.1, and the use of carbon fiber to drop the weight under 3,000 pounds. But Ruf wanted more, and designed a brand new 4.5-liter naturally aspirated V8 themselves, which made 543 horsepower at 8,500 RPM. Oh yeah, they stuffed a V8 in the back of a 911. People do that as a side project in like custom builds now, and they've been doing it for a while. Hell, I literally raced against one at an autocross event recently. But on a production level side, this is the first and only V8 power 911 to actually reach the production stage. Yes, it's way off the pace of their CTR line, especially for 300 grand, but the fact that the RGT8 even exists is fantastic. Speaking of the CTR line, the CTR3 debuted in 2007 and is actually still in production today. The biggest change was to take the CTR away from the 911 platform to the Cayman, which made it mid-engined. That also meant it got a brand new roof design body. No more simply modified panels for this one. The first CTR made a perfectly reasonable 691 horsepower, or the same as the most recent GT2 RS. But if you got the CTR3 Club Sport released in 2012, you could get more. As in, Ruf moved the needle to a record 766 horsepower, 723 foot-pounds of torque, and a top speed of 236 miles an hour. That's insane! So far, 37 CTR3s have been built, and only 7 of them are the truly mental Club Sport packages. But still, it's an insane production car. And that was not the first time Ruf was adventurous within the Porsche brand. They obviously made more normal Caymans, like the 3800S in 2017, that only made 414 horsepower, or more strangely, the Dakara, a tuned version of the Cayenne that was actually slower than Porsche's own Turbo S. It didn't really last very long, obviously, especially for $330,000. Even more uselessly, they did actually make two electric concept cars, the E-Roof Greenster, which went nowhere, and the E-Roof Model A, which also went nowhere because it made a whopping 200 horsepower. Not very impressive considering they make 766 horsepower Caymans. But what about now? Currently they only have two new 911 models, this time being based off the old 991 generation. The GT makes 500 horsepower and the Turbo Florio. It's a target top of 636 horsepower and an optional 6-speed manual. But Ruf's new bread and butter is a selection of classic models that they produce. The Porsche 964-based RCT Evo that harkens back to the old-school Turbo S days, the 993-based Turbo R, which is more in the vein of the BTR2 in terms of styling and horsepower, and even the R5611, based off of the 356 Coupe. It's actually the lightest Ruf ever made at just 2,300 pounds, and it looks like it rolled off the assembly line in 1955. That also means it has just 168 horsepower. Definitely the oddball out of Ruf's lineup, but I like that they added it to their range. The other big thing you'll notice about their current model range is that a lot of their cars are based less and less off of actual Porsches. Because between 2016 and 2020, tensions grew between Porsche and Ruf over video game licensing and some advertisements on Porsche's forums. It wasn't so much that Ruf didn't like Porsches, as it was that Porsche had become fed up with Ruf. So Ruf designed their own body for the CTR3, and their own cars entirely, starting with the one that launched their company to stardom. The CTR Anniversary may look similar to a 964 Porsche, but that's all it is. Similar. Everything, including the body and chassis, are built in-house by Ruf. That chassis is now a carbon fiber reinforced steel monocoque with a carbon fiber body on top. That means it's only 2,600 pounds and it has the latest performance goodies, most notably push-rod suspension and a dry sump lubrication system. And fitting with the CTR theme, the in-house designed 3.6-liter flat 6 makes 700 horsepower and pushes the car to 224 miles an hour. Only 50 will be made, with each one costing around $1 million. If you want something a little bit less intense and more affordable, you can get the SCR, which released a year later. It too was inspired by the 964, but it's a little heavier than the CTR and a little less powerful, just like a lower tier car should be. Granted, it's still $800,000, which seems a little bit excessive for 500 horsepower, but I guess quality equals costly. Only 15 will be built each year, but unlike the new CTR, they have not announced a production cap. So any Porsche with a spare $750,000 can buy a brand new SCR. Or maybe just get a Singer.